and I'm very pleased to have Wilneida Negrón talk to us today. And the topic of her talk today is the little tech coming for workers, documenting, investigating, and building worker voice and power. So let me tell you a little bit about Wilneida Negrón. Wilneida is the Director of Research and Policy at Coworker, where she leads participatory research and investigations with workers and advocates to examine the changing nature of the workplace. Her work on emerging technology, touching on the labor process led to the first comprehensive database of employment technologies that is being used by workers, government advocates, academics, and journalists to understand emerging trends and design organizing, policy, regulatory, and storytelling strategies. She has a specialization in social and political implications of emerging technologies in East Asia and Latin America, public administration, and international and global affairs. Dr. Negrón is a lifelong fellow for Data and Society Research Institute and the Atlantic Fellows Program for Racial Equality. Wilneida, you are up. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And I really appreciated that Donna Summers song as well. But it's great to be here with you guys and to be able to talk about the research that we've been doing at Coworker. As it was mentioned earlier, Coworker is a sort of a laboratory for workers to find each other and to experiment with different power building strategies. And for someone that, like myself, that comes from the research angle as well, it really, because we build networks of workers, it allows us to, and I'll go into the disclosure first, but it allows us to be able to talk to workers across many different industries. And so that is where sort of the research emerged in really understanding what's happening across many industries. Before I get into that, I do want to share that the financial disclosure that I know everyone's been sharing, that there's no relevant financial relationships or commercial interests to disclose, especially as I'm going to show a lot of company and different vendor information. It's important to disclose that up front. And so again, Coworker supports workers through the petition, through leadership development that we do behind the scenes, as well as through our mutual aid fund, and that are through our C4. And for that C4, we're currently supporting the Starbucks worker organizing, and as well as the tech worker organizing. So those are the particular industries right now that we are supporting through our C4 through mutual aid. And so because of the way that we build networks and relationships with workers across many industries, from retail all the way to white collar work to pharmacy work, it allowed us to, as we were seeing, the pioneering work that scholars like Karen Levy were doing, looking at trucking industries, and really Ifioma as well, looking at hiring technologies. Just a lot of scholars were looking at industry specific types of technologies, and we were really interested, as we were talking to workers across many industries, we realized that what we were discovering, product by product, was a phenomenon, for lack of a better word, that didn't fit into sort of the big tech kind of framework that we have for understanding technology's impact on society. We knew that what was happening in the workplace and technology, again, this is going back 2-3 years, was different. And we tried to go into tech policy spaces that were, rightfully so, we're still dealing with the impact, with the rise of big tech. And a lot of that work was still focused very much in that there was not a lot of spaces at the time to really think about the intersections of labor and tech policy, in particular to the way that workers are encountering technology. And so by collecting, it started with 5 or 10 different products and vendors and quickly went up to over 600, which we have in our database, and we could have kept going easily into 800 and possibly even 1,000, but we felt like in terms of showing the prevalence, which is really the only reason we did the database, was just to kind of quantify, because again, as we try to engage embedding a labor perspective in what's been a very dominant big tech consumer focused framework, it was very hard to have conversations with elected officials around understanding what was happening in a workplace, and that not to have competing, but just understanding, creating two tracks for sort of engaging with these issues, a big tech and a little tech. And so we framed it as little tech because it gets less attention, but as I mentioned before, what started off as some workers coming to us asking about an app that they had to download, to other workers talking about different pharmacy workers and CVS talking about different productivity monitoring. It quickly, and then doing our own market research, corporate research, particularly because when we started this, it was at the beginning of COVID. And so we noticed that there was obviously a lot of money going into digital solutions in the workplace. And so it quickly proliferated, and we tried to quantify some of that. And so the interesting thing is that it's little tech because it's many different smaller vendors. We're not talking about the 4 or 5 major big companies: Amazon, Facebook, Twitter, Meta, and Apple, etc. We're talking about hundreds, if not thousands, of different products that are entering the workplace. And so little tech was just sort of a framework for talking about that. And what we noticed as well was that the products are really interacting with every part of the labor process. And so while there was a focus on workplace surveillance, rightfully so, and productivity monitoring, there really there's at every step of the labor process, from hiring and recruitment, which I'm sure many of you have already heard about some of those technologies, to workplace safety, to workplace productivity and monitoring, to workplace risk management, to even things like upskilling, to ways that workers access public benefits. At almost every single step, workers are just interacting different types of technology and products. And so it's extremely prevalent, and it requires a lot of attention. And we're extremely excited by the work that has been going on really in the past year. Obviously, more regulatory agencies and more journalists are covering this issue, and there's just more academic research. And so this is all really important, but it really brings us to, what do we do with this problem that is so prevalent, touches workers' lives, and it creates, a clunky mix of different strategies than maybe the way sort of the tech policy and the big tech conversations have been going, which is sort of like overarching privacy bill, along with looking at anti-monopoly. The issues that workers experience is going to include both kind of labor focused interventions, as well as like interacting with non-labor federal agencies, as we're seeing with the White House, legal strategies, et cetera. And so as it's getting more attention, hopefully we can also start to co-strategize together. And so not only is there tech in every across cross-cutting technologies, there's also, when you look at particular industries, which is what we did in our study, even those industries have hundreds of other products. And so here, this is just a snapshot of, when you look at retail, you're looking at a combination of different types of technologies. When you look at things like e-commerce infrastructure, there's lots of different kind of manufacturing, worker risk scoring technologies. It's really, again, naming their role is interesting because they require some of these, to deal with some of these companies, you may be engaging in a particular different set of harms versus other ones. In particular, I'll call out, and I think it's in the slides, a company like Appri's Retail, which was recently acquired by one of the bigger big data vendors, Oracle. And it's a workplace management product, but it's the way that it's being, once it's been acquired, it's now going to, Oracle is going to integrate criminal justice data as well. And we try to get more information into how exactly criminal justice data is going to interact in a workplace management, risk scoring type of product, and weren't able to get any information. And so there you're dealing, again, increasingly so with like the intersections of consumer and workplace data. And so that may call for a different set of interactions with regulatory agencies than one that would be more kind of labor focused, like hiring and recruitment technology. And so it's really the strategies are really multifaceted, and you have to, unlike big tech, you really have to work at the industry level, because it is, if you focus on one particular company, you're going to miss probably the 5 or 10 other that are doing the same thing as that one. And so you have to look at sort of industry interventions. And so this is a link to the database. We are expanding the database, we're updating it, and we're expanding it to be global because there was an interest to sort of following the money that has dried up with the economy that we're in, but following the money that was there for venture capital that was really fueling a lot of investment in gig economy companies. There were a few global majority countries that were recipient of some of these funds, venture capital funds. And so there was an interest to sort of see what is being invested in the global majority that could help some of the strategy and some of the conversations and organizing. And so really generally there were, we tried to classify the workplace technologies across 4 different sections, and we focused on workplace safety because there was, this was, again, a lot of the data was captured during COVID. There is a lot of workplace performance and productivity monitoring. There is labor market optimization, which is products or companies that try to optimize workers. And this is sort of using the framing of business management. And so that includes some automation products and companies. That includes gig economy companies, which we've also have been tracking the emerging ones because they're obviously using a informal gig economy labor management model to maximize workers, taking advantage of sort of workers' precarity to maximize the sustainability of these business models that gig economy rely on. And so we did include them as sort of labor market optimization. And in workplace benefits, health and well-being products, that includes products such as during COVID, Kroger, we were supporting a few petitions by Kroger employees that were trying to push for hazard pay. And in response, the company did not pay hazard pay, but they did offer these apps that allow, it's called Earned In, one of them. And it basically allowed workers to access their paychecks earlier. And so that was sort of the response to the demand for hazard pay was, we're not going to give you hazard pay, but we know that you have emergencies, so we'll let you access your paycheck sooner. And we wanted to collect those kinds of apps as well that had we're not addressing workers' concerns. But in addition, when you looked at sort of the small print and the privacy, they were also highly problematic. And some of these apps have been covered in the media with just the fact that they collect a lot of the workers' data as well and sell them to third parties. And so really the whole scheme of products, we wanted to be able to just document and better understand. And so just looking at some global trends that we saw across all of the industries before I go into some of the specific products, was that this chart is essentially the growing prevalence of workplace monitoring technology companies. And so you can see the classifications, and I'm sorry that the chart's a little bit small, but the products have been, and the companies and the vendors, they have been steadily increasing, particularly as technology gets increasingly sophisticated. And as you see there, 2021, 22 were sort of peak periods. And a lot of the products that are growing are in that time was workplace safety, but also you see an increase in labor market, which again is that very broad category that includes everything from gig economy to automation, just products that try to optimize the efficiency of workers without necessarily the monitoring and the surveillance that's in the other section. And so it's been steadily increasing in the past 30 years. I think what's concerning that we're all tracking now is the attention given to AI and a lot of the funding that's going to AI startups at the moment, and thinking about what this chart might look like in the next 3 to 5 years, and what types of companies and products may be emerging that may not even fit some of these categories. And how worker data is being captured, again, for all of these products, we really, to the best of our ability, try to really dig in and try to understand how they are collecting data. And we saw that most are app. There is, if you look in the lines, the timeline below, there is an increase in using the camera and using bots as well. And that sort of interactive features, you see them a lot in hiring and technology, that may walk workers through a series of steps, and they actually collect what we found in the small print and the terms of agreement is a lot of that is collects the information that workers input into different bot features that it has. And you also see there, things like camera and a censored and keyboard, which has historically sort of been the main one of the main keystrokes logging the ways to measure productivity. And so we've gone from keyboard stroke monitoring to collecting lots of different data. And Lisa Kresge and the work of UC Berkeley Center has really done an amazing job of then showing what are the types of data and the expensiveness of the types of data that are being collected through these different ways. We also, looking at the small print for these products, also found that most have third-party sharing agreements. The majority, this amount that were not sharing, that made explicit comments that they did not share the data with third parties, was very, very small. We saw that most do not allow workers to access and interpret their own data. Most don't allow workers to correct incorrect data, and that there's no grievance mechanism. And so, as employers are procuring, I know this is sometimes hidden in those terms of agreement that we may even skim through as we are downloading apps. So managers and employees that are purchasing these products, this really matters. And so when you look at the fine print and you see that most vendors and most companies right now that are building workplace technology are not really built for transparency and for empowering workers, and let alone our employers also being transparent and empowering workers. It's really, you're dealing with, employer and vendor responsibilities that don't exist. And therein exists some of the avenues we're pushing needs to happen, is on the employer and on the vendor side. And shifting the burden from workers, which I'll get into towards the end. And so we did look at what data protection legislation any of the products or vendors listed, and most of them did note complying with CCPA and GDPR, which is brings up, we at a very small sample for those that did say they complied. We did send requests to sort of the privacy officer, to the vendors, not to the employers, and didn't receive any information. And so there in itself is a whole project that we don't have the capacity to do at Coworker, unfortunately, but that is one of the learnings was like, if we could just go through all of these vendors and just that say they comply this, and then just follow through and test their accountability to what they're putting in, because otherwise vendors are getting away with just putting very generic, we saw very similar types of legal statements of privacy without any accountability. And again, that's workers at the end, especially already vulnerable and marginalized workers that are having their data utilized in ways that they may not understand, and being shared with third parties in ways that they might not realize. And it's incredibly, when you think about those two things, and you think about already sort of the economic challenges that worker may be going, it's really highly disturbing to think about what they're facing, what they may not realize they're facing. And so looking at the types of products, this first type of product is the workplace productivity and monitoring that many of you have seen. This is one of the more popular ones, Active Track. And these are the dashboards that are being given to managers to use. And a lot of these collect, there's sort of, your key work logging, more sophisticated type of management system. And they tend to provide daily and weekly reports, monthly, yearly. And so there is both, real-time situational awareness and historical information that's collected. And again, as that information is collected on a historical basis, it makes you concerned of exactly, might there be an incident that you have at work where some historical pattern may show up on one of these products, and you might be penalized in some way. And so the situational awareness, the historical data, and again, workers not fully knowing is concerning. A lot of these also are doing, productivity scoring, ranking workers by how productive they are. And again, to not the knowledge of workers. The second types of products that we're seeing are social listening and mood tracking products. This one is Aware's organizational insights solution. It's used in by pretty large employers, everything from IAG to AstraZeneca in the pharmacy industry, to some financial services and banks. And this collects a lot of not only your, how productive you are, but also sentiment analysis, things like conversation health, how toxic language is, trending keywords and themes. And so it is collecting your mood and your behavior patterns in the workplace. And this is especially concerning because a lot of this data is, again, highly personal, and what you would we're seeing a lot of in a lot of spaces that there is a push for listening to workers. We're starting to see that miss focus on sort of the wrong solution in HR communities and maybe some corporate spaces where, like, we want listening devices, and we want to listen to workers, and we want to create a good workplace culture. Again, this is how it's sold to employers. And so these are listening tools. You can, a well-intentioned HR manager could possibly use this to really listen to the personal life and really support workers. But this could, obviously, we all know that this could also go incredibly wrong. And so you cannot take a chance on this kind of technology, again, without some basic protections for workers, and protections, and as well just transparency of what could go wrong. And even so, I wanted to flag that we also looked at upcoming patents that are being filed by some of the bigger companies. And Microsoft had just completed a patent for this is a picture from one of their patents that they filed, and it's essentially a system to monitor a mood and sentiment in physically in meetings. And so it uses some facial recognition, and it's going to capture the mood and score workers by how attentive they were in meetings, how satisfied they felt, etc. And so there's more development happening. Already what we're seeing is highly concerning. And what's coming up when we look at patents that are being filed, what's coming up ahead is just continuing down the path of highly intrusive personal data collection, not well-placed corporate functions that are trying to be served, not well understood products on how to use them what are the risks, etc. And sort of vendors not many of them engaging around policy uses, etc., risk to their products. They're just sort of selling these products to companies under the veneer of just sort of how good they can help, how well they can be for having healthy workplace culture. The next type of product is that with increasing data collection practices and sophistication of AI technologies, we are seeing increasing risk scoring of workers, and employers, again, are concerned about everything from workers disclosing private business information, hackers getting into the IT systems, internal workers going rogue internally, and even unionization efforts. That there is technology now that is collecting workers' data and then making particular predictions as well of what types of workers could go rogue. And so some of these particular products are also measure everything from reputation to behavior, to also collect, some of the additional websites and movements that workers may do, even when they're off the clock on a lunch break, or even working from home. And so that's one of the concerns has been, is especially from working from home, is that some of these products have allowed workers to continue to monitor habits, and a lot of these products can be downloaded without workers knowing about them. And so there is just not, again, the issue of transparency, and the pervasiveness of these products is what is highly problematic, is that you just never know how far they're going. And in terms of organizing, that was 2 or 3 years ago, there was a lot of focus around Amazon in particular, that was found to be utilizing this product to look at particular keywords associated with and movements of workers that were potentially unionizing. But there's, a variety of them, and these are just some of them. Oracle, used in the, white collar work. It looks at, it can analyze, identify workers that have been interacting on social media with potential union workers, to even products like Worktingo on the right-hand side, which is, it looks at, again, you can use taking some of the sentiment analysis, again, that can help for employers to listen and to improve workplace culture. It can also equally be used to capture frustration, dissatisfaction, and make predictions of workers that might be either going rogue or thinking about organizing. And there's also this particular product, which many of you may have already heard about. Ask in particular, it sends a survey, sort of end of the day survey to workers. And, some of these, almost like what you see in hiring and recruitment tools, it'll have workers select from a set of questions. Like, for example, in hiring and recruitment, Upturn has done a lot of really good work in this, which is sometimes you have to complete a personality test, and some of the questions that they ask are highly, and not only intrusive, but just problematic of how they're deciphering what would be a cultural fit. They may ask things like, do you enjoy everything, things from like, do you enjoy working groups to do you enjoy listening to workers that may talk negatively about other workers, like just a variety of really convoluted psychological questions that are, again, when you put those in a hiring and technology, when you're thinking about your potentially getting a job and you have to go through a personality test, and when you're in the workplace like this tool, where you have to answer things like, does my manager treat employees with respect? Am I appropriately involved in decisions? Things that may grab at discomfort. You can make yourself vulnerable to being flagged as problematic. And so your HR may be telling you, no, we just want to understand if workers are happy and how we can make things right. But what we have seen is you have employers that have also used it problematic. And so InterGuard is one of those products that I'd mentioned, that can be one of a few that can be installed on devices covertly without workers knowing. It can be installed, and it's and InterGuard is not a new product. I'm sure we have all heard about it. It's been around at least over 10 years. And so we try to get a sense of how many employees are using it, and that in itself is transparent. And so we don't know how prevalent a product like InterGuard, that's one of sort of the original, more one of the products that is capturing worker productivity, but covertly one of the first ones, like how prevalent this product in itself is. And so again, looking at the challenges that when you go, as you've seen from some of the speakers today, when you go into the trucking industry, when you go into call center work, when you go into Amazon, into one employer, there is a different story of risk to tell. When you talk about disabled workers going through these personality tests and the hiring recruitment, which led the EEOC to issue guidances, like the stories that workers have to tell, call center, truck drivers, disabled workers going through using personality tests. It is a powerful testimony, but it also is the risk and the harms go beyond well beyond privacy. And so this is where engaging the employment and as well as non-labor agencies really gets into the picture. And so a secure store is the one that I had mentioned earlier, and it's used possibly by Target, and it's the one that was acquired by Oracle, and it has a specific solution in itself that is used in retail, and it sorts retail workers by risk, and so does Oracle Retail Solution. And so every industry has a particular solution and extraction of data and loss of privacy and loss of economic security story to tell, as well as for the workers, as well as for even the interesting thing, even for managers, as we're seeing, one of the themes of the little tech work is that it's coming really for every type of worker. And so we are seeing similar types of products eliminating managerial roles. And we can just imagine with the interest in AI, in generative AI, that we're going to really start to see the workplace, no worker being unaffected from workplace technology that's entering. And really quickly, so we can go into how workers are pushing back is, these are some of the specific ways that workers, pervasive forms of productivity monitoring, call center, finance. It's really interesting to be able to talk to workers across many industries about the different products that they see, because I would say that we lack sort of an overarching framework to talk to workers. Sometimes, surveillance doesn't resonate. Sometimes bossware does with different workers. And so how can we, for us, the next chapter of this research is really talking to workers, doing constituency education, and really trying to understand of like, how can we begin to frame this in the way that workers are seeing it, because, and this goes into sort of the solutions, what needs to be understood now by some of the regulatory agencies is the particular harms that workers are experiencing. And workers, for them, technology in the workplace, to see it in the eyes of us that are much more trained in sort of the political economy of these technologies, it does require some bridging to happen in order for workers to understand, one, they have power, they have voice, they deserve protections, and they have rights, and that just the help them understand the intensity and the severity of what some of these, what feel like a redundant, H&R product. I'm sure we're all of in our workplaces, HR may introduce a product and we just sort of, click it off and don't pay attention. We are that study these trends, we're sounding the alarm, but we cannot sound the alarm and have solutions without workers behind us as well. And so we need to do that education. This is some of the hiring and recruitment technologies. And these are some of the other types of technologies that are not in the workplace productivity. Their earning is the one that lets, sort of like the payday loan for workers. Unemployment, there were, workers, we saw many workers interacting, especially unemployed workers, with ID.me to access benefits. And even workers interacting with tenant screening services. And so again, at every step of the process, workers are engaging. Did you want me to turn to, I don't know how we are with time.
Well, we're actually out of time, and I really apologize that we can't finish your presentation,
good.
but your slides will definitely be included in the YouTube recording of the conference. And I just wanted to say I appreciate so much all the hard work you obviously and your team has put into put into collecting these data. And I'm hoping that members of the audience will be able to look at the information that you've collected and will be able to start working either with you or in sync with what you have in order to increase the protections for the public from personal and organizational risk. So thank you. Thank you so much. I don't know what to say, except I wish we could have heard everything that you have to say. So
Not a
thank you.
problem.
Thank you for participating.
Yeah. Thank you for having me. Good and good luck, everyone.